It's 1850. You're 3 weeks into a voyage across the Atlantic. Last night, a storm tore your ship apart. You're alive, floating, clinging to a piece of broken mast. But here's the part that should terrify you more than the ocean. Nobody knows. Not your family, not your government. Not a single soul on land has any idea that anything went wrong. You won't be missing for weeks. You won't be searched for. Because right now, at this exact moment, you don't even exist as a problem to anyone but yourself. So here's the question that's about to ruin your idea of the ocean forever. If you vanish out here, does the rest of the world just keep going like nothing happened? Let's back up. Most people today assume the ocean has always been watched. That somewhere someone is tracking every ship. A satellite, a signal, a blinking dot on a screen. That's a modern comfort. And for most of human history, it simply didn't exist. Before radio, a ship that left port didn't just sail away from land, it sailed away from time itself. Once the coastline disappeared behind you, you weren't just far from home. You were unreachable. No calls, no updates, no way to say I'm alive or I'm in trouble. You were a rumor waiting to be confirmed, and that single fact changed everything about how disaster worked at sea. Think about it for a second. On land, when something goes wrong, help is usually close. A scream carries. A fire is seen. A messenger can run for a doctor. At sea, none of that applies. The nearest ship might be hundreds of miles away, sailing a completely different route with no way of knowing you exist. So when a ship went down in the 1700s or 1800s, it didn't create an emergency. It created a silence, and that silence is where the real horror begins. Here's the part that never gets talked about. It wasn't just the sinking that was dangerous. It was the not knowing, for everyone. Picture a wife in Liverpool. Her husband left on a merchant ship 6 months ago. The expected return date has come and gone. Is he delayed by weather? Is he simply late? Or is he already dead at the bottom of the Atlantic? She has no way to know. There's no news update, no Coast Guard call, no wreckage report. All she has is time. And time, when you're waiting for someone who might already be gone, becomes its own kind of torture. Entire communities lived like this. Coastal towns where overdue and lost were basically the same word, just waiting to be confirmed. Some ships took a year or more before they were officially declared lost. Not because anyone found proof, but because enough time had passed that hope quietly ran out. That's the first hidden problem. Loss wasn't an event. It was a slow realization. But here's where it gets worse. Let's go back to you. Floating on that broken mast, you assume maybe that ships routinely search for survivors, that there's some kind of system. There wasn't. Before radio, if your ship went down mid-ocean, there was no way to broadcast an SOS because the technology to do so hadn't been invented yet. No distress signal could travel faster than a ship itself. So how would anyone even begin to search for you? They'd need three things they almost never had. Someone who saw it happen. A way to report it quickly. A rough idea of where it occurred. In the vast, featureless ocean, all three of those were incredibly rare. If another ship happened to pass by afterward, sometimes days later, they might spot wreckage, floating debris, a damaged lifeboat. But by then, most of what they found told a story that had already ended. The search wasn't find survivors. Too often, it was identify what remains. Now, here's a twist that most people never consider. Even when a ship successfully survived a disaster, patched a hull, weathered a storm, limped along without navigation, arriving at a delayed port didn't necessarily fix the fear that had already spread. Because news, once it started moving, moved through rumor before it moved through fact. A ship might arrive in port 2 months late, alive and functioning, but by that time, word may have already spread that it was lost. Family members might have already begun mourning. Insurance claims might have already been filed. Some sailors literally came home to find their own memorial notices already printed. Imagine surviving the ocean's worst, and then having to prove to the world that you're not dead. That's not just a maritime problem. That's an identity crisis born purely from the absence of information. So humans were faced with an impossible challenge. How do you manage risk in an environment where instant communication doesn't exist? At first, the answers were desperate and improvised. Sailors began using something almost laughably simple by today's standards: message bottles. Write your situation, your position, your fate, seal it, and throw it into the ocean, hoping some future stranger might find it and pass the word along. It sounds almost like folklore, but it wasn't a joke. It was one of the only tools available when every other option had failed. A last desperate attempt to leave a trace of your existence behind. Some worked, most didn't. But the fact that sailors relied on floating glass bottles as a communication strategy tells you everything about how alone they truly were. But bottles weren't a system. They were a last resort. The real shift came from something more structural: signal flags. Ships began developing standardized flag codes, specific colors and patterns that could communicate simple messages between vessels that could see each other. I need assistance. Man overboard. Danger ahead. This was revolutionary, but only under one condition. You had to be close enough to see another ship, which meant, in the middle of the ocean, flags were often useless. They only worked in busy shipping lanes or coastal waters where ships were more likely to cross paths. Out in open ocean, you could wave every flag you owned and it wouldn't matter because there was nobody there to see it. This is the paradox of pre-radio safety. Every solution only worked in specific conditions, and the ocean rarely cooperated. So what actually kept sailors alive long enough to be found, or to save themselves? The answer surprises most people. It wasn't a system. It was preparation, discipline, and pure human ingenuity under pressure. Sailors developed rigorous survival protocols. Lifeboats stocked with rationed food and water. Strict rules about rationing under scarcity, sometimes just an ounce of water per day, sometimes nothing but collected rainwater, and whatever fish could be caught by hand. Some of the most famous survival stories in maritime history involve sailors drifting for weeks, sometimes over a month, using nothing but the stars to estimate direction and pure willpower to stay alive. Not because a system saved them, because human endurance did. Here's the bigger realization hiding underneath all of this. Before radio, safety at sea wasn't built on rescue. It was built on prevention and self-reliance because rescue often wasn't realistically possible. That single fact reshaped an entire culture. Sailors weren't trained to expect help. They were trained to survive without it. Ships carried extra supplies not because regulations demanded it, but because everyone understood. If something goes wrong out here, you are your own Coast Guard. This mindset shaped maritime law, insurance systems, shipping schedules, even the design of ships themselves. Reinforced hulls, redundant lifeboats, strict captain protocols during storms. Every one of these existed because humans had accepted a brutal truth. The ocean doesn't notify anyone when it takes something from you, and this reveals something much deeper about human nature. We tend to think of communication as a convenience, a nice thing to have, something modern. But communication is actually one of the core pillars of survival itself. Before radio, human beings at sea were essentially isolated nodes with no network. And in that isolation, our species didn't collapse. It adapted. It built codes with flags, it built rationing systems, it built rituals of patience and grief for families waiting on land. It built entire legal systems just to define what lost even meant. In other words, even without technology, humans built structure out of uncertainty. That's not a story about ships. That's a story about us. So back to that moment. You, floating on broken wood, alone in an ocean with no way to call for help. You survived not because someone was watching. You survived because long before you ever left port, humans had already learned how to prepare for a world where nobody is watching at all. And maybe that's the real, unsettling truth hiding beneath the whole story. For most of human history, being lost didn't mean someone would come looking. It meant you had already learned, long before disaster struck, how to save yourself.